My guest is Amnon.
No.
Okay.
Please.
Okay.
10 seconds. 5, 2.
My guest is Amnon Rubenstein, and we're at his home here in a suburb in Tel Aviv. Mr. Rubenstein is a member of the Knesset. Mr. Rubenstein, let me begin by saying that from the American perception, we're well aware of the fact that there are conservatives and liberals, and you would generally be lumped into the liberal category. But from the American perception, it seems that across the broad spectrum of Israeli politics, there are at least two things that nearly everyone in Israel would agree on, and that is, number one, that no one would favor the creation of a Palestinian state, and that number two, everyone, or just about everyone, would agree that the Israeli government could never agree to divide Jerusalem again. Is that essentially correct?
Yes, that's elementary consensus in the country.
So where do the divisions really come in which politically separate, for example, someone such as yourself who's regarded as a liberal and someone such as Prime Minister Begin?
I would like to stand corrected on one thing. We all object to the creation of a Palestinian state, a third separate Palestinian state on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But if a combination of Jordan and chunks of the West Bank would like to consider themselves as a Palestinian state, having a Palestinian majority, I don't think the type of Israelis that I represent object to it. In other words, what we object to on grounds of security, self-defense, self-preservation, I would say, is a separate state adjacent to our very back garden, to our very homes, which would have all the trappings of sovereignty, which would have an army, an air force, diplomatic capacity to invite foreign, i.e. Soviet counselors. To that we object. But to the idea of Palestinian self-determination within a Palestine, which includes Jordan, I think about half of the people in Israel would agree. And the whole thing about this Palestinian state is totally slanted. It's a product of Arab propaganda. It has never been mentioned before '67. Palestine has always been considered as including Transjordan, including the east bank of the Jordan River. And only after the Six-Day War was this thing invented as a spearhead against Israeli security. Because what you have is the Jordan separates not only between the same people, same religion, same culture, same language, same everything, family ties, brothers, cousins, but you have the same political tradition. Even under Hussein, when we had rebels and demonstration in Nablus, we never had the demand for a separate entity in the West Bank. Now, compare this. In Lebanon, we have a bloody civil war going on for 10 years between Christians and Muslims. And everybody, including the Arab League, including the United States, including the common market countries, say and insist that Lebanon must remain one state, Lebanon as it is. That the Christians must live within a unitary state with a Muslim majority. And every demand of the Christians to separate statehood is being rejected. While here, in the West Bank, where there's no ground, there's no claim to a separate national identity, the world gradually accepts this claim to a separate state. Why?
Because Palestine never really existed as a state historically. After the Ottoman Empire, which controlled the area for some 400 years, then there was the British Mandate, and then after World War I, essentially, all these countries, such as Syria and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, are relatively recent creations, perhaps not as recent as Israel, but not much older.
Well, almost as recent as Israel. Jordan, almost as recent as Israel. But the main thing is not the history. The main thing is the demography, the political fact. Let's assume that King Abdullah of Transjordan, when he formed his own independent kingdom, would have called it Palestine, as was one of the ideas. He could have called it Palestine. It was part of Palestine. And most of his people were Palestinians. And most of Jordan's citizens are Palestinians. And most of the prime ministers who have served under the Hashemite kingdom have been Palestinians. and the civil service and part of the army.
Well, the incredible irony then about the whole situation is that going back to 1970, there was almost a civil war, if not a civil war, between Jordan and the PLO.
That's right.
Well, why isn't Jordan willing to accept the Palestinians as part of their country?
Because the major issue and the crux of the matter in the Middle East is not the PLO or not the Palestinians and not such issues which make headlines. The main issue is one thing: the refusal of the Arab world adamantly to accept Israel's existence. They do regard the whole of Palestine, including where we are sitting now, as sacred Muslim land. And everything else serves as a weapon in this war against Israel. The Palestinian issue is a convenient issue, and we foolishly made it even more convenient. It's a convenient weapon against Israel. But the issue is not the Palestinian issue. True, we cannot find a solution to the Israeli-Arab conflict without finding a conflict to the Palestinian issue. But the main motive behind the conflict is not the displacement of the Palestinians. It's the refusal of the Arab world, refusal front, those who do not want to follow Sadat's example in making peace with Israel. And this refusal, this total boycott of Israel, this, I would say, psychological refusal to come to terms with the Jewish state is the root cause of all conflicts in Israel.
Well, if that is the key and the root cause, as you say, what needs to be done so that Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, other Arab countries will eventually follow Egypt's lead and recognize that Israel does have the right to exist?
Well, a lot depends on what Americans do and what Europeans do. I think that...
All right, what should America do? Because obviously this is going to be shown to an American audience. I think Americans are very interested in knowing and understanding what they should do to help achieve that goal so that the Arab countries would recognize Israel's right to exist.
I think Americans should tell their Arab friends, and they have friends in the Arab world, two major things. One is that this whole conflict on a relatively small and poor piece of land pales into insignificance by comparison with the Soviet menace. And I would tell the Arab friends that they must realize that to every conflict adjacent to it must be that to every conflict must be added a sense of proportion. And I would give them one illustration. Before the Soviet Union annexed Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia and all the Baltic states, and before the Soviet Union created its empire, there were conflicts like the Jewish-Arab conflicts between these different states. Border conflicts, national, ethnic, cultural conflicts. Who remembers that now? They were swamped over by armed Soviet might. Now this danger looms above everything else. This danger should be the one thing which should place the Arab-Jewish conflict in some perspective. That I would tell them. And as I understand, the Secretary of State has tried, has attempted to tell certainly the rulers of Saudi Arabia that, but to no avail. But I would repeat that. The other thing that I would tell the Arab countries, the moderate, pro-Western Arab countries, is that they should realize that Israel is here to stay.
How can they not realize that?
No, they don't.
On any objective, realistic basis, how can they not already realize that Israel is here to stay?
No,
It seems to me they just don't want to accept it for political reasons or because they're frightened of the PLO or they feel they have to take certain stands. It's impossible for me to believe that Arabs of ordinary intelligence honestly believe that at some time in the foreseeable future that Israel is going to disappear. It just isn't going to happen.
This may sound irrational, but Arabs strongly believe that with dwindling support for Israel, with dwindling American support for Israel, with a strong anti-Israeli slant in Europe, they have a chance of realizing this long dream of pushing us to the sea or seeing Israel disappear. Let's use a more euphemistic phrase. And that must be uprooted. Not only that, they must realize that terror doesn't pay, that the methods of the PLO alienate them from American public opinion. That what happened in Vienna with the killing of Jews in synagogue, that what happened in infamous hijacking of planes, what happens as a matter of routine along the borders, is something which American public opinion will not stomach. And then I think that if you persevere in that, and if you leave options for peace open, and this is a duty which is incumbent upon the Israelis, that's the other side of the coin, there is some chance for a solution to the conflict. Some chance. After all, before Sadat came to Jerusalem, few people believed that we'll see an exchange of envoys between Israel and Egypt, and tourists visiting the two countries. And what brought Sadat to Jerusalem was the realization that there's no other means of getting Sinai back. There's no other means of getting American support, of changing his orientation from pro-Soviet to pro-American. And if that sort of American clear-sighted policy is elucidated, is clarified, I think there's some chance that the Arabs will come to terms with Israel. When this moment comes, Israel will have to make concessions. There's no doubt about it. And it is here on this point where we take issue with the Prime Minister and with the government.
Well, hasn't the world, and certainly revolutionary groups, really learned, unfortunately and tragically in this modern day, that terror is in fact tremendously effective? Because you and I know that the best-known Palestinian in the United States of America, by far, the Palestinian who receives infinitely more media coverage than anyone else, the Palestinian who has been on the cover of Time magazine, is Yasser Arafat.
Yes.
And Yasser Arafat, in front of the United Nations, does not come before that body as a murdering terrorist who throws bombs at innocent women and children. The Lod massacre is not remembered, or Kiryat Shimona, or all the terrible, vile things of throwing bombs on buses, which have nothing to do with courage,
yes,
are exactly the opposite.
The opposite.
And there are many moderate Palestinians who seem to take the position that this is necessary for us to get any recognition in America, and it has certainly worked in Europe.
There's one major difference between Arab terror and all other acts of terrorism that you have in Europe, such as the Turks, the Armenians, the Croatians, the Basques, and whatnot. This is the only terrorist movement which engages in such cowardly acts, as you have rightly, aptly described them, which gets the full support, the patronage, the coverage, the financing of sovereign states, members of the UN. And that is something which explains the success of the PLO on Arab terrorism, Palestinian terrorism. And that difference must be pointed out to and must be realized by Americans. And the American, what we expect, the American administration, what we expect American political personalities to do is to tell the Arab friends that this condemnation and active support of terrorism, all their bases are in Arab states, all the finances, everything, the offices, the information services, that sort of support for terrorism will not pay. It may pay in the short term in mass media. We all know what makes news. Crime makes news, hijacking, kidnapping, and certainly acts of terrorism. But if you want to achieve some sort of solution, if you want to arrive at some sort of modus vivendi with Israel, and if you want to, and that is the main thing, and if you want to do something about the Soviet menace, they have to put an end to this sort of protection, advocation, and support of terrorism.
Why has liberalism basically fizzled out in Israel? And I use that in the context of the democratic movement for change was supposedly going to represent a new liberal thinking in Israel, and they at one time had 15 seats in the Knesset. Your party broke away from them, and now in the present Knesset, there's you and one other member representing your party. What's the reason for that?
I think there are a couple of reasons. First of all, I think there is a natural, understandable need to give support to big parties. We don't have a constituency system in this country. We have proportional representation, but nevertheless, people want to support the big parties, the big blocs, the two big contenders. They want to support a winner. A winner. The other thing is, in this election, there was a special emphasis on the issue of violence, on the issue of Mr. Begin. There were two kinds of, I would call it, mass movements. One was to support Begin, which we saw in every public square, in every public meetings, and there's hundreds of thousands of people, you know, shouting Begin, Begin. And the other one was a reaction of fear and anxiety, which dominated the more, let's call it, the more well-established, the old-timers, the people of European origin in this country, who were scared and frightened by what they saw. So they flocked to labor in order to counteract this danger, which they saw as a terrible danger to very quality of life, political life in this country. So all the small parties were smashed by this process. The party headed by Mr. Dayan, who, according to public opinion polls, only 3 months ago should have received 19 seats, got the same number of seats as we did, 2 seats. But I believe that in the long range there is no other way for Israel but to resort to the liberal, to the middle course, to the middle of the road, to the sane way.
Well, all right, let's talk specifics. What is the middle road, the sane way, from the standpoint of the settlements, the occupied territories, and really the critical issues that divide Israelis and which are of major importance to Americans?
Okay. 5 seconds. אנחנו רצים. 5. אז מי מתחיל? מראיין. אוקיי. Quiet please. 3, 2. No?
You've spoken of the sane, moderate course. Well, in terms of specifics, the issues that divide Israelis and that are very important to Americans, the occupied territories, settlements, what is the sane, moderate position with regard to those critical issues?
I think the same position is to recognize facts and not to base one's policy on historical rights. And the fact is that there are two different people in this common land of ours. Call it Palestine, call it Eretz Israel, call it the Holy Land, call it the Promised Land. One is Jewish and one is Palestinian Arab. And there is no sane solution except to divide this divided land between them. Because they cannot live together. They do not want to live together. They have developed throughout this long conflict a wrong image of one another. And the only way to solve this problem is through the partition of Palestine, as envisaged and as accepted up to 1967. Now that doesn't mean that Israel can withdraw to the former borders. We just cannot do that. I mean, Americans don't realize how precarious the borders are, how small the country is, minuscule, not much bigger than the new airport in Fort Worth, Dallas, and with the surrounding area. And Israel, Americans don't realize that when we are talking about the 1967 borders, you're talking about an incredible vulnerability. We've got one airport, one international airport, Ben Gurion. Now the former borders is tangent, adjacent to it. You could shoot at any plane, not by using guns or mortars, just by using rifles.
That close?
That close.
Well, your bottom line then appears to be, in terms of the sane course, you would give back the occupied territories for peace.
I would give part the inhabited parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, where the big concentrations of Arab Palestinian inhabitants, in return for peace, provided there are two basic military, I would say, vital, crucial conditions met. One is the total demilitarization of the West Bank, a DMZ zone. Israel cannot fight a war along a border which cuts through its living room. And the other thing is that we must have, at least for an indefinite future, a defensive belt along the Jordan River, along which we can fight the initial war. It should be how can I describe it, a security tripwire. Israel doesn't have a regular army. Our regular army is very, very small, insignificant in comparison with the huge regular Arab armies. We must mobilize the whole nation as part of our reserve force. Now, in order to mobilize this reserve force, in order to have the time needed to alert the people, to take them from homes, from work, and to mobilize them into fighting units, you must have some time, minimal time. We've cut down this time, but you must have some. If you're going to fight a war, you must have some system under which you would be able to alert and draft the reserves. If there's no demilitarization, if there's no DMZ zone, if there's no defensive belt along the Jordan River, the war will be fought right here at the very heartland of Israel. We need these two conditions in order to enable us to fight at least a delaying war, a delaying battle, an initial battle, a tripwire, as it were, in order to mobilize the reserves. And this is why we cannot go back to the 67 borders. And these two conditions, a DMZ zone and a defensive belt along the Jordan River, are things on which I think the great majority of Israelis, the crucial majority, unites.
Right, you talk about recognizing facts.
Yes.
The reality. Well, one fact is that Orthodox Jews regard Judea and Samaria, the West Bank and Gaza, as the land that God promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs, and it's holy land, and their position is simply that we can never give it up. Can you overcome that Israeli block of opinion, assuming that you were ever in a position of power to do what you suggest doing with those guarantees?
Not all Orthodox Jews accept this point of view. There are many, many Orthodox Jews, including famous rabbis and sages, both in this country and America, who do not abide by this point of view, which sees political issues through the prism of divine promises. And I can assure you that religious public opinion is divided on this issue too. Though you're right, there is a very strong militant part of Orthodox religious Jews in this country who have led the campaign for the Greater Israel, for the concept of sacred, divine land, which Israel has no right to give up. But I think the great majority of Israelis will not accept this point of view. There's still reason in terms of their own self-defense and security. And it's interesting to watch how Israelis react. When given a partner, there's no end to their flexibility. When given a partner along the Egyptian front, when Sadat came to Jerusalem, he got back the whole of Sinai, plus the oil, the airfields, the naval bases, the settlements, the new towns there, on a silver platter in return for peace, in return for a signature. Now, before that event...
Well, which? A signature or peace? Because obviously many say that when Sadat goes, however he leaves power, what have you really got with Egypt? Who knows who's going to succeed Sadat? And who knows if in return for giving up the Sinai and everything you've just mentioned, you really have a viable peace?
Who knows? We shall keep our fingers crossed. All I'm trying to say is that with regard to the Arab conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, it takes two to tango. And in Egypt, we had somebody to tango with.
And you don't on the West Bank.
And we gave up things which even confirmed doves would never have believed that we are going to give up. Israel has moved overnight from total self-sufficiency in energy to total self-dependence on energy.
As a result of...
As a result of withdrawal from Sinai, and yet we were ready to do that in return for peace. But in the West Bank, in the Eastern Front, in the North, we have no partner, we have nobody to tango with. And what I'm saying is that given the right gesture, given the readiness to make up with Israel, psychologically, mentally, the great majority of Israelis, I strongly believe in that, will be ready to forego historical considerations to which I too am a partner. I too am not neutral with regard to Judea and Samaria, to the cradle of our civilization, to the very sites whose name means so much to us. But they will be ready to give up their historical attachment to parts of this country in return for a chance to live in peace. A chance. Not even the confidence, because we have no confidence. We just have a hope, a wish, that we shall live in peace with Egypt. We have no assurance. But just in order to have that, we are ready to give up a lot. But up till now, the problem has been that we have no partner. What we see from across the border is total rejection, total non-recognition, threats which are uttered in terms which are really incredible. I don't think the world even knows about it. Actually, what the PLO says and what the PLO wants to do is to have a Judenrein, I'm using the German expression, Palestine.
Meaning
A
what?
Palestine free of Jews. And as long as this attitude persists, of course, we can do nothing.
Well, it's interesting because friends of Israel in the United States who understand the American psyche and understand the force of public relations in the media say the smartest thing for Arafat to do, and the thing that would really should worry the Israelis most if he ever got some good public relations advice, would be not to change in fact, but to change verbally. And that all Arafat would have to do is say, we do now recognize Israel's right to exist, and we recognize Resolution 242, yet continue to do everything they're doing now, but simply by virtue of mouthing those words, he would gain tremendous American support. Does that concern you, that possibility?
But isn't it significant that he cannot even make this verbal change?
Very significant.
Isn't this characteristic that even such a useful weapon, tactically, which would mean nothing, all America and Europe wants to is to him to mutter, to mumble some ambivalent phrase about 242. They don't even want him to recognize explicitly Israel's right to exist. They just want him to say some ambivalent thing, which can be caught onto, which can be used as an alibi, as an excuse for recognizing the PLO. And he can't do even that. This is no coincidence, because his very raison d'etre, his very existence, the very credo of the PLO is based on this concept of the total annihilation, destruction of Israel. But I would, if you would ask me what happens if this comes about, I'm not content with Arafat accepting Israel's right to exist. I don't need his recognition to recognize my right to exist. I don't need his confirmation. I don't need...
You don't, but to America and Europe,
Well,
that would be of infinite importance.
Yes, well, I would try to explain to the Europeans that this is nonsense. That nobody needs to have his right to exist confirmed by a terrorist. That what I expect from Arafat, from the PLO, and I really don't expect them to reform, but if at all, thinking in American terms, thinking in European terms, I would say that what we expect from him is not the recognition of Israel's right to exist, but to enter into specific arrangements and pacts which will ensure Israel's security. In other words, what I expect him to do is something along the lines which Sadat took. And I don't want this mere declaration. I don't need it. I can live very well without Arafat recognizes my right to live.
Well, why has the situation crystallized to the point that when we talk about the Palestinians, Arafat seems to be the whole ballgame? Because there's no counterweight in terms of a moderate Palestinian who is saying things like, look, just like you were talking about recognizing facts, saying to his Palestinian brothers, look, Israel is not going to go away. Let's make a life for our people. That kind of attitude out of a Palestinian mouth is getting no attention nationwide. And it would seem to me that Israel would have even had a tremendous interest in helping to create that kind of moderate Palestinian leader so that there would be some kind of counterbalance to the PLO. Why hasn't that occurred?
It's a great mistake, one out of many that we have committed. We should have encouraged an autonomous body in the West Bank immediately after the Six-Day War. We should have encouraged moderate leaders to stand up and speak out. Now I'm afraid it's too late. I hope I'm wrong. But to speak out in the West Bank along lines which contradict the PLO is asking for trouble, and I'm using an understatement here. It means that you're going to be
Murdered.
murdered.
In other words,
bombed out.
if a Palestinian mayor on the
Yes.
West Bank or a prestigious Palestinian said what I just said, the likelihood is that he would be murdered. And
Bumped
obviously,
off.
obviously he knows that.
He knows that. Everybody knows
So
that.
you're basically admitting that it has been a terrible Israeli mistake to permit the situation to reach that point.
One out of many.
Well, what are some of the others?
Oh, a legion. It would take a long time to recount them. But our whole concept after 67 was wrong. We should have encouraged self-rule immediately, before Arab extremism and fanaticism had time to become so strong. And we should have realized that we should keep the major part of the territories as an option for peace, at the one hand. On the second hand, to encourage moderate leaders to have a dialogue with us and not to wait for Hussein and not to wait for other things, not to wait for miracles. Miracles don't happen in the Middle East. They used to happen a long time ago.
Well, of course, the incredible irony about the whole Camp David peace process, and in America that's all you hear from the standpoint of let's get the Camp David peace process moving again. And by that, everyone assumes we're talking about the autonomy situation. The incredible irony there is that Sadat, who is despised by the Palestinians, despised by the other Arab states, is in the position of attempting to negotiate for the Palestinians with the Israelis, the only other group that is hated as much as Sadat. I mean, it's mythology, isn't it? It's not going to happen.
That's true, with one caveat, one proviso, that in the Middle East not only the sands are shifting, attitudes are shifting. Positions which seem to be very strongly taken shift overnight. And it's true that that hasn't happened up till now with regard to the Israelis, except for Egypt. But we do hope that one day, a day of reckoning will come, and the Palestinian leaders will say to themselves, we get nowhere unless we sit down at the table and discuss our problem with the Israelis the way Sadat did, according to the Camp David procedure, which is fair, more than fair to the Palestinians. And when that day comes, I think a lot of things which are seen now as insurmountable obstacles will disappear. We had the same experience with Egypt. My fear is that unless this process comes, peace with Egypt will turn out to be non-viable, and that Israel will be facing the danger of being left out without Sinai, without the oil, without the airfields, without everything, and without peace. That is a nightmare.
How do you explain Sadat's public relations genius in the sense that he does better in American polls than any Israeli leader?
Okay, cut. Okay, cut, please. The same question.
On the next tape.
Next.
Okay?
Ask it again?
On the next tape,
Okay.
yeah.
Right, the next tape will be the last tape. Okay.
Okay. You look in the Amnon, please.
We're just going
Wait
to
now.
do intercuts at the end of the
Intercut.
What was my last question?
Do the intercuts.
Oh,
No,
Sadat's.
only look.
Just look. That's easy. I'm a good looker.
Yeah.
How do you explain Sadat's public relations genius? Because whether you know it or not, he does better in the American polls than any Israeli leader. Here is a man in America, of course, because of Pearl Harbor, despises the idea of a sneak attack, yet President Sadat picked the holiest day of the Jewish year, to attack Israel and to inflict great losses on Israel. How do you explain his popularity in the United States? And I understand he's pretty popular in Israel as well.
He's very popular in Israel. Actually, President Sadat is so popular in Israel that many political observers believe that what was seen as his endorsement of Prime Minister Begin had a very important impact in switching votes for the Likud, for Mr. Begin's party. So maybe this is a paradox, but I don't think Israelis bear grudges. This is a point I was trying to make before, that given the right partner, Israelis will be ready to
Dance with almost anybody.
Make concessions, and let bygones be bygones. It's the other side which doesn't let bygones be bygones, which keeps hammering in all the injustices, all the grievances from time immemorial. But I think President Sadat is seen as a peacemaker, as the first Arab leader who has smashed this wall of enmity, as a friend of America, as a friend of the West. He's a clever man, he's an astute man, and therefore he's very popular, as I'm saying, in this country too.
Mr. Rubenstein, you're a lawyer, and most Americans are aware of certain basic differences between the U.S. government and the Israeli government. You do not have a written constitution. You don't have jury trials. But in a few minutes, how would you basically explain the essential workings of the Israeli, let's say, the criminal justice system?
Well, the Israeli legal system is a hodgepodge, a patchwork of different things, but the main element is the British common law, which the British introduced in this country.
So in that sense, there's a great similarity between the American system, because that's where we derived our basic law.
Yes, and American cases and authorities, especially, of course, those of the Supreme Court, are often cited and quoted in our courts because of this common heritage. But unlike America, of course, we are a parliamentary democracy with a non-presidential system, the non-constituency system, and in this respect, we have taken more from Britain and Europe than from America.
And by the way, I think that until the 1981 election, that most Americans didn't really understand that there has never been any party elected in the history of Israel that had a majority of seats, that there's always been some form of coalition government.
Never, yes.
And that was a widely misunderstood
Yes,
fact about
yes.
your system.
The system is totally different from this point of view. It has common links with America through the common law. And the common law still governs the major branches of the law, like criminal law, law of tort, law, to some parts, law of contract. But you must remember that the British here in Palestine have not introduced all the paraphernalia of their own common law. And one of the things that they didn't introduce is a jury system, because they didn't want Arabs and Jews and Christians to sit in the same as juries, and thus exacerbate friction and ethnic strife. And we have retained this British omission of not having a jury trial, partly for the same reasons. We still have a very problematical society in this country.
Well, Britain itself has done away with the jury trial for nearly all cases. I think slander and libel.
Slander and libel, yes. And the other reason is that many Israeli lawyers have come to the conclusion that jury trial is too risky a game to play when it comes to criminal justice. So you have the combined things, both the same consideration which has motivated the British not to introduce a jury system in a divided society, and a recognition which is gaining headway in other countries that you must move from jury system to professional judges. The British have also retained something which still confuses many American observers, and that is the relations between state and church, or mosque or synagogue. The British have retained the old Ottoman Turkish rule, which gave autonomy to religious groups, to religious communities, not to Jews, but to Muslims, to Christians, and to Jews and others. Now, the British have retained this, and we have retained the British system. We have retained the status quo on these issues. So every religious community has its own exclusive jurisdiction, mainly on matters of family law. What we
Marriage,
call
divorce.
marriage and divorce. No, the Muslim courts have a wider jurisdiction than the Jewish courts because of this Ottoman tradition, the Ottoman Empire being a Muslim state. But the Christian, the Druze, and other small communities have jurisdiction mainly on issues of marriage and divorce. So in Israel, there's no established church in the American sense, as many Americans think. There are certain autonomous rights to all religions. And Judaism as such has no privilege over other religions.
Well, what is the power, for example, of the chief rabbi in the system?
The chief rabbi has little power. He has more power, his persuasive power, his power over those who believe in orthodoxy. And even that is diminishing now because of the new frictions which we have been seeing recently. But under law, the chief rabbinate has no power at all over secular, except for rabbinical court on issues of marriage and divorce. Unfortunately, the issue is not one between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, but the issue is within Judaism, that unfortunately we do not have in our legal system the same rights accorded to Reform and conservative communities as we have to the Orthodox group. And there are small conservative and Reform communities in this country. And if you ask me what is the liberal view that people like me and my party advocate is to grant total equality to all groups, communities, and streams in Judaism, conservatives, Reformed, and Orthodox, all alike.
That's the position of your political
That's
party.
the position which we take.
Okay.
That's
But of
not-
course, the position of the state in practice is it's only Orthodox.
It's only the Orthodox as they had been under the British mandate. Actually, from 1948, we've had the status quo with minor modifications, and the system, the Ottoman system, has retained its force.
And in terms of an Arab getting a fair trial through the criminal justice system, do the same rules apply to an Arab living in Israel as opposed to a Jew?
Oh, definitely. We've
No
just-
discrimination?
No, I would say that in the courts of law, there's total equality. Not only that, I can tell you one thing. We've had a big case now decided between two companies with millions of dollars worth. This was decided by an Arab judge. I mean, sitting in Tel Aviv is the district court judge, and that is accepted. And many magistrates are Arab.
Now that's a statement that you just made pretty matter-of-factly, but a lot of Americans will blink when you talk about an Arab judge they would expect to be maybe on the West Bank or in Gaza somehow, but you're saying that there are Arab judges right within Israel proper.
In Tel Aviv, in the district court. And we hope to have an Arab judge in the Supreme Court soon. That's Prime Minister Begin's wish. He has come out publicly with it. Not that we have full equality for Israeli Arabs in all spheres of life. I wouldn't be truthful if I would claim that there's total equality in everything. But legally, constitutionally, there is total equality. And Israel has observed the rule of law under circumstances, under strenuous circumstances, to a degree which is amazing. We never had a case, as America had, of Americans of Japanese origin being incarcerated in camps. We never had anything like that. And we have abolished, in the middle of all this conflict, preventive detention.
Mr. Rubenstein, thank you very much. You have proved that all lawyers are not necessarily long-winded, because you've pretty well summed up the differences between the Israeli and the American legal systems in just a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Do you have also Vietnamese in Florida? People from Southeast Asia?
Hardly. A few.
Will there be a Cuban mayor of Miami Beach? Of Miami, sorry.
There's a Puerto Rican mayor now. Begin?
But they may, sorry.
אני אתן להם קיו, חבר'ה. שקט.